review of some kind. The introduction is your literature review. And we know that research is cumulative, and we know that we're building on what has come before in most cases. It's very rare that you start a project where nothing has been done. So in order to find out what's been done before, we do a literature review. But a bad literature review can be worse than doing no review at all. So instead of doing a bad literature review, which will go into the sort of reasons why some literature reviews can be bad, systematic review aims to address a lot of the issues with a sort of more traditional narrative format literature review. So we've kind of categorized the issues that can come up in a literature review into sort of three main areas of bias, which is what a systematic review aims to address. So that includes the bias of the reviewers themselves, so the people writing a review, the overall bias in the literature, and the biases or issues of quality that can exist in individual studies that you're looking to include in a review. So a systematic review aims to address this. So the first point I mentioned was the bias that exists within the reviewer themselves. So one thing that's really important to mention is that these biases aren't always intentional, and I would expect a lot of the time are not intentional. So we're talking about those kind of intrinsic human biases. So to give a few examples of how this could affect a literature review, you've got the availability heuristic, which kind of relates to the privileging of information that more readily comes to mind. So the things that you think about first are things you're most likely to include. Attentional bias, so our limited capacity to attend to many features, and we kind of sort of hone in on some things and ignore others. Confirmation bias, cherry picking. So we're more likely to pick literature that conforms with our point of view, again, not always intentionally. And something that Dorothy Bishop has spoken a lot about recently, which is poltering. So that's where the researcher isn't making a false statement, but they're omitting key contextual information. So the sort of thing that politicians do, really. So the second kind of area of bias that a systematic review aims to address is the overall literature bias. So we're talking about things like publication bias, citation bias. So a paper by De Vries et al., I'm sure quite a few have seen this figure before. This kind of shows really clearly, I think, the issues of publication bias and citation bias. So what we have in column A over here, these are a selection of clinical trials looking at antidepressants. So very important area of research that we need to get right. So you can see that of those trials that existed, about 50% of them, I think, had null results or negative results, sorry, and about 50% positive. But we know that positive results are more likely to get published, so you can see the knock-on effect in column B. Most of those that end up published are the positive trials. You can then see the kind of cumulative effect. And then, again, one of the areas that systematic review aims to address is also this effect of citation bias. So you're more likely to cite the papers that have positive results, and you end up with something that looks like this, where even though 50% of the trials have negative results, very few of those are being cited. And if I remember correctly, the size of the circles here kind of relate to the relative number of citations that they're receiving. So more positive studies are being cited, and more positive studies are being cited more frequently. So you're losing a good amount of the research like this. And then a kind of third aspect of bias that we are trying to address in a systematic review is are the kind of quality issues in the individual studies. So it's really important to know how you judge the quality of the studies you're including, because you cannot give equal weight to several studies if the quality is drastically different. So you might have a very high quality study with a negative result, you might have a very low quality study with a positive result, and we all know which one of those is going to get cited and listened to more. So systematic review aims to kind of readdress that balance. So for those of you that aren't familiar with the process of doing a systematic review, so there's a reason that people find them quite daunting. They have a very sort of strict and rigorous methodology. Step one is to formulate a research question. Step two, you develop a very clear protocol, which includes things like a search strategy, inclusion, exclusion criteria. Ideally, this will be pre-registered, but that's something we'll talk about later. So your search strategy is basically a set of keywords that are arranged in such a way that you can then plug that search into a database of papers and get out a whole bunch of papers relevant to the topic that you want to do. Creating a search strategy is quite a time-consuming and difficult process. You need to be using Boolean operators, so and, or, not, and you can often come out with thousands of results from this, which is, again, another reason that systematic reviews are quite daunting. So once you've created your protocol, you've developed your search strategy, no, thank you, sorry. So once you've, it's fine, don't worry. Once you've developed the protocol with all of this, you then need to actually start performing the review. So once you've got those potentially thousands of results, you then have to go through and screen them against your inclusion exclusion criteria. So your inclusion exclusion criteria will be things like what participant groups are you looking for in these studies, what study design, outcome measures, that sort of thing. So you'll screen, usually you'll screen the titles and abstracts to kind of end up with a fewer number of papers that you need to deal with, and then you will screen again, looking at the full text of those articles. You will then, the next step is to extract the relevant data. If you're doing a meta-analysis, which is a component of a systematic review, it's not a necessary component, but it's a common component. This is where you will extract the data, the relevant data for your meta-analysis, but you also might just be extracting information about the participant groups, study designs, etc. Then you will do your quality assessment. So there are a lot of existing tools and checklists that help you to do this. It's something, again, that we'll talk about a little bit later because it's not as easy as it sounds. You will kind of quantify the quality of the papers that you've included in your review. And then finally, you will get to the point where you can synthesize that information into a review. So it could be a qualitative synthesis. You might just sort of describe the results, the studies that were included, or you may do a meta-analysis. So it kind of brings us on now to why NIRO, which is the project that we've been working on. So NIRO stands for non-interventional, reproducible, and open systematic reviews. So we're trying to fill a gap, but I will tell you what gap that is and why we felt it was necessary to fill it.
Hey Jade, I'm just jumping in, if that's okay, to
Sure.
speak to some of the comments that have come in. So some people have mentioned librarians, so can you comment on that, or what is your experience?
Oh, wow, I did not notice that there were so many questions in the chat. Yes, good point. So librarians are brilliant sources of support when writing a systematic review. I consulted with the librarians at Manchester, so when I was doing systematic review for my PhD. if you're doing a systematic review, definitely talk to a librarian. Let me just double check that there isn't something that I've missed. Yes, okay. So librarians will know all of the sort of nitty-gritty details of how to do a systematic review. One of the things they don't know are tools that don't yet exist, which is where NIRO comes in. So when you're writing systematic review, you will follow a set of guidelines that already exist to make sure your systematic review is as rigorous and high quality as it can be. So there are plenty of gold standard guidelines out there, such as PRISMA, which is probably one of the most famous, if not the most famous guidelines, which stands for Preferred Reporting Items for Systematic Reviews and Meta-Analysis, if I recall correctly. The problem with, well, it's not a problem with the tools themselves because they were built for this purpose, but they are built for the synthesis of interventions, clinical trials, and sort of basically everything that would come under the branch of healthcare related research. So there are kind of initiatives going on to help bring systematic reviews to areas such as ecology, but there is still something missing. We'll come to, on the next slide, I think, we'll come to the issues that we faced individually from our perspectives. But yeah, so guidelines exist. They are amazing at what they do, but they're not always fit for purpose. So we know that a clear protocol is necessary for doing a systematic review, but if you don't have the guidance, that becomes really tricky. And it's also quite intimidating if you're inexperienced and you're doing a first systematic review, which as early career researchers, we are probably doing our first systematic review or one of our first systematic reviews. So when it comes to writing a systematic review from a different angle, so I'm not going to speak for everyone here, but I know a lot of the people involved in reproducibility are psychologists or come from psychology, cognitive neurosciences, though there will be other fields as well. But often they're not healthcare related researchers. So it's difficult to find a tool that you can adapt to write a systematic review when you're talking about very different kinds of research. And not having a standardized tool means you kind of end up forcing the existing guidelines to fit your purpose. And once you start editing rigorous guidelines, they don't become rigorous guidelines anymore. And it's also important to kind of assess the quality of systematic reviews that already exist. If we don't have the right guidelines for writing them, it's very difficult to comment on the quality of those that are written, if that makes sense. So I'm just going to finish my section by just talking about my experience and why, sort of what led to NIRO. So my background is in cognitive neuroscience. So I do research with people with Parkinson's. I look at executive functioning in Parkinson's. So it's kind of, I was fooled into thinking that this would be fairly easy for me to do. It would be easy for me to do a systematic review because Parkinson's health, like it seemed at first glance to fit what the guidelines were for, therefore sort of more healthcare research. But my research question doesn't fit the kind of models that were in the guidelines. So a lot of the guidelines suggest you try and fit your research question into this PCOS model, which stands, so the P stands for population patients problem. So my systematic review was looking at the differences between people with Parkinson's and people without Parkinson's on a variety of measures. So for my systematic review, the P is obviously people with Parkinson's and people without Parkinson's. I stands for intervention. There is no intervention because you either have Parkinson's or you don't. C is comparator. Again, you have Parkinson's or you don't. O, outcome, that seems straightforward enough. It was sort of performance on task A, performance on task B. And then S, study design. often the guidelines talk about study designs like, was it a randomized design? Was it controlled? Was there blinding, which didn't really fit with what I was doing? It's very difficult to blind people to Parkinson's because it's a motor disorder. It's not always obvious, but in a lot of the cases, it's not something you can blind people against. So I couldn't fit my research question into this model, and the research question is step 1 of a systematic review. So when you've fallen down at the first hurdle, it makes everything else way more difficult. So I also struggled when it came to the risk of bias and quality assessment. So there was no real applicable guidance. I tried editing. I tried this with 2 tools. I tried to make my own. First, I tried adapting the Newcastle-Ottawa scale, which went very badly. Then I tried, which one was it? I tried editing the Downs and Black scale, I think. That went less badly, but still not brilliantly, and I just abandoned the whole thing because I realized that by trying to force these tools to fit my purposes, I was just introducing way more bias than I was controlling for it. So I am now just going to hand over to Marta to take it from here and talk about her experiences.
Hello, my time to speak. Thank you, Jade. So starting with my own experience of a systematic review, it was slightly different in a way that it was part of an assignment that I was doing for my master's degree. So it was quite a while ago. And it was a very frustrating experience, even though it was just an assignment and it wasn't like a full-blown massive systematic review. It was like a taster, so to say. It was from a module that I took from a different master's course that I could add on to my master's, and it was in health psychology. And so systematic reviews are really important, and they're assessing a lot of health outcomes and how they link with different psychological theories. And so because I was in a different master's program, I picked a different topic that wasn't health related. And so I realized that I can't really do a systematic review on my topic because the guidelines that I was given did not address this type of research. And I did speak to different staff and researchers at the university, and they couldn't really direct me to any guidelines or any resources that I could use to run a systematic review on the particular topic that I chose, which was on motor functioning. And so I was just basically kind of advised in the end. I refused to do a health-related systematic review because I thought it wasn't helpful for me personally with the research that I do. So I wanted to stick to motor functioning, and I was advised, okay, use one of the tools that we have here available and just adapt it, just do whatever you feel is right. And that's what I ended up doing whatever you feel is right, but you don't know what you're doing. You're just learning about systematic reviews for the first time. And I hope I don't have to explain to you why this is problematic, but the sort of the whole situation is just a little bit absurd. And if we are to do high quality systematic reviews, then we need to have guidelines specific for the studies that we want to do. And so I'm not going to go on for too long on that, but we have another example from one of our collaborators, Faye, who is in a different type of research as well. She is in social psychology, and she studies jury decision making in criminal trials, and you can see how far removed from health research this is as well. And she wrote a lovely big testimony airing out her frustrations as well, about how the PCOS structure was not appropriate, and finding this hurdle at the beginning really makes it really hard throughout the whole workflow of systematic reviews, and it brings a lot of problems down the line. And she also explained that the risk of bias and quality assessment part was especially hard as well, because you need like a separate tool for this as well to assess all the different studies that you include in the systematic review. So yeah, those are our frustrations, and this is why we started NIRO. And here you can see sort of like a background around the project. It was conceptualized in January 2019, and we have a lovely picture here of the advanced methods for a reproducible research workshop at Cumberland Lodge. This is not a picture of our collaborators, this is a picture of people who were there. And I know that some of you who are here were also attending that time, so it's a nice throwback. So this is where it started. Jade asked a question after Dorothy Bishop's talk regarding the lack of resources for non-interventional research, and I had the same question in mind, so I just spoke to her after. And somehow we decided that there is a problem and we're going to fix it, and here we are. So we gathered a large number of collaborators because we thought that we can't just do it by ourselves, and it was a great decision. We have a very international and multidisciplinary focus, so we're not just based in the UK. Our collaborators are scattered around the US, Asia, Australia, New Zealand, and Europe and the UK, and we have psychologists, meta-researchers, librarians, ecologists and data scientists, and people who are very interdisciplinary in their focus of research as well, which really helps. And they are at different levels of career, and it really helps to have some more senior people and some more junior people, because then it helps us to make sure that we have everything we need in NIRO, but also that it's accessible and understandable to people who don't have much experience with doing systematic review. And most of our collaborations are through Slack and Zoom, and NIRO lives on Google Docs as well, and it's possible to do that. I think that's it for that slide, unless you have anything to add, Jade. No? Cool. So how did we start with NIRO? That was quite difficult to think sort of how to create the content for it. So we just looked at all different available resources that exist, and we listed them, and then we took the sort of individual items from those guidelines into a document, and we sort of listed them all together one after another. So I think we found in total around 18 different guidelines, which is quite a large number if you think about this. If you're starting a systematic review and you need to decide which tool to use, which is a relevant one for you, there's actually a lot of choice there, and you can see that we identified 517 items among all those tools. And then we realized that Prisma 2020 is going to have an update, and they pretty much did a similar thing where they collected an item bank to see what is missing from Prisma and what would be nice to have added to Prisma for this new update. And they had a very, very large item bank as well, and we decided to just go through it and identify the things that we don't yet have in our item bank. So there were about 55 items there, and we put them all together, and that was our massive item bank of 572 items, which me and Jade went through one by one, and we sort of coded them, whether we want to have them in NIRO, so as yes, whether we think that they might be relevant, or whether we think that they are important to have, but they are not yet suitable for NIRO because it's non-interventional. So the maybe items were ones that we would have to translate, so to say, to non-interventional research. And then we have the excluded items, and we also gave them different categories for why we were excluding them. So most of them, as you can see on this graph, were relevant for meta-analyses, and we don't yet want to focus on meta-analyses. We want to be focused on systematic reviews for now, just sort of without the meta-analysis component. And then quite a few of them were very specific to clinical or interventional studies where we didn't feel like it was possible or necessary to translate them to non-interventional. And then a few other ones related to formatting, or they were a bit incomplete or vague. So that's how we ended up with a total remaining or maybe items as 463. So you can see that we still kept lots of them, and it was still quite a lot to handle.
Hi, Marta. Can I briefly, sorry, thank you so much. Can I briefly interrupt you with a question from Emma before we move to the next slide? So you're getting showered with compliments in the chat, by the way. So Emma says, such great work. I'd love to know your tips for managing international collaborations across disciplines like this. So I thought that was maybe you can briefly comment on that. I thought that was a really nice question.
Sure, it's a very important question, and me and Jade will be doing some reflection on collaborations at the end, so maybe we can wait until that. We have a little slide dedicated to this because we also thought as early career researchers that it's important to talk about this and share the experiences and encourage others to also do that. Cool. Okay, so I'll continue with this for now, and then we can talk about the collaborations at the end. Okay, so we have the 460 something items now, and what we did is that we divided them into different categories again, and those categories translated to the slide that Jade showed earlier on the different steps of systematic reviews, and we excluded things, or we joined things that were referring to the same item, so to say. So any duplicates, we kind of joined them together, and we reduced it a lot, and then we went on to the translation process of the interventional items to non-interventional items. So one example that I wanted to give to you here so that you can see it is the research question example right at the start of planning your systematic review, and you can see the PRISMA PCOS guidance on creating the systematic reviews here. So we have the participants, interventions, comparisons, outcomes, study design, like Jade suggested. And then on the other hand, we have what we created for NIRO. And you can see that it looks a little bit more extensive here, but in essence, we kept 3 items to be necessary or compulsory to keep in the research question, and that's the dependent variable, independent variable, and population participants of interest. So you can see that the wording and the focus of this is then easily adaptable to non-interventional research that we might do in our everyday work. So we don't have to think about we don't have to do the translations ourselves. It's provided here, and it's tailored specifically for the type of research that is non-interventional. And then we kept the study design as an optional one because we don't want to say that you have to in your research somehow constrain it. If it's a very niche area and there aren't that many studies there, maybe you just want to have a look at what's there, what's available. And same with the covariates of interest. You might want to control something like age or anything else you want to control for it. If you have pre-specified, you can put it there, but it might be the case that some of the factors that you might need to control for will then only be identifiable through your synthesis. So we didn't want to restrict it either. So this is more or less how we have done it. And obviously it's not just coming from me and Jade. We had it reviewed by our collaborators and making sure that other people also find it useful. And there was quite a process of rewording things and making sure that we encompass as much of areas and types of research as possible, research that is not interventional. And so one more thing that I wanted to mention about the open and reproducible solutions as well, about NIRO, is the open and reproducible solutions. So it is in our title, and it is something that we want to commit to. At the moment, none of the guidelines actively stress the fact that the systematic review should be open or reproducible, or that there is risk of bias, so to say, in the way that they are conducted. There is some information about risk of bias from the individual studies themselves, but the other 2 levels that Jade has mentioned before are not actively presented as problematic. So that's what we wanted to do with NIRO. And the things that we have implemented is the fact that we encourage, strongly encourage, and we almost suggest that it's not right not to pre-register a systematic review on an open access platform, so this can be easily accessed by other researchers. We also give guidelines for our protocol to avoid and control biases. So for instance, we give suggestions that it shouldn't be just one person screening the records that come from the screening strategy, from the search strategy. It should be at least 2 people. And there's lots of other guidelines like these throughout NIRO. And we also encourage researchers to document as much as they can on the different decisions that they make, so that they can be replicated, and so that sort of other researchers looking at this study don't have to guess what was done, basically. And then sharing those documents and decisions and any tools that they have been using, like the extraction guidelines, what information to extract from each study. All of those materials, we strongly encourage that they should be openly shared. Right, and so I think we can come to this slide now where I tell you what's in NIRO. Yay! So after all of this and the long process, NIRO came to life, and this is only the first draft version that we have. It's not yet published in any journal. We decided to make it available to people because we still want feedback. So if anyone wants to start using it in their work and they find any problems, or they want to give us any feedback, then we're very open for that. And we thought that this is a very nice sort two-way benefit, because we can make improvements and the tool is already available there, so they don't have to make their own adaptations. And so it's split into part A and part B. Part A is the protocol for pre-registration and how to prepare it. We give some general guidelines on, or guidance on pre-registration first for those who are not very familiar with this. So we have like a FAQ section with the commonly asked questions. And then we go on to the guidance on preparing the protocol for pre-registration. And you can see the sort of sections here, so title, description and names, research questions, search strategy, screening, data extraction, risk of bias, synthesis, and transparency. And something that is quite unique for NIRO is this transparency section. Whilst some of the other tools have some items on transparency, they don't actually promote the whole transparency section where it encourages researchers to actually think about avoiding biases and thinking about making this work as transparent and open and reproducible as possible. So once this is pre-registered, we then also give guidance. Sorry, Jay, couldn't go back a slide because I've not gone to part B yet. We give guidance on the actual writing up of the review, and that has sort of follows the title, introduction, method, results, discussion of a paper with the different sections relating to the pre-registration and then synthesis of results as well. And again, the discussion part also has a nice transparency section to reflect that and reinforce it a little bit more. Okay, that's it. And I just wanted to let you know where you can find NIRO. So we have a website. Thank you, Matt, who is available here, attending today. Thank you, Matt, for helping us to put this website together. The website is there to host all our future developments of NIRO. So there's much more that we want to do with NIRO. It's not just the sort of pre-registration and how to write it up. We want to develop the risk of bias tool as well. And kind of take it towards other directions like meta-analyses or qualitative research as well. And so all those developments will be hosted on this website. But we also have the OSF, and at the moment the actual PDF file for NIRO is on the OSF available to download. And we will be putting the item bank there as well once it's all finalized, and the preprint, etc. So this is the actual sort of file holder for NIRO. And I think that's it for NIRO, and I think we can go through to the reflections, although I know that we've overgone with time. So I don't know if you want to take other questions, or should we start with the reflections?
I think the reflection would be great, especially because people want to have focus on that. It would be great to do this slide.
Cool. Okay, brilliant. So for the, I will speak first about my experience, and then Jade will also, I will give space to Jade to also share her thoughts. But I think that generally having the collaboration really worked very great. We were very apprehensive at this start because we didn't know how we were going to manage this. And all our collaborators are very enthusiastic, and I think that it really helps. It's a real driving force. And even if sort of we take longer than we expect at the beginning, because collaborators often ask about when do you want me to do this by, or what is the deadline so I can work by it. We sort of give rough deadlines, and we say, well, if you manage to do something by this time, then that's great. Otherwise, me and Jade, we organize sort of working days, and we just update our collaborators that this is the day that we're going to work together. If you want to contribute by that date, you can send or prepare this, and that. And at the end of the working day, we then give updates of the progress that we've made, and people can decide whether they want to continue working on their section that they were interested in, whether they want to add anything, or we sort of give them directions of what are the next steps. And that kind of helps quite a lot, I think, sort of sending regular updates of how we're doing this, and not keeping strict deadlines, because we don't want to be stressed. We don't want our collaborators to be stressed. And it kind of, I think that a lot of you might be able to sort of understand what I feel when I say that it's a much nicer work compared to my PhD, where I feel like we're making progress and the progress is much smoother, and I don't feel stressed about it. And it's just, everybody is so enthusiastic and so happy about doing this sort of pet project on the side. It's very motivating generally. And maybe one thing to consider with, I think the question was asking about collaborating with a group of people from diverse backgrounds and from sort of at different levels of career. I think that the most challenging thing is to make sure that we respond to all the comments and that we make the final decisions on how we want something to look. Because there's a lot of things a lot of directions that we could take NIRO towards, but we have to stay very focused and we have to take it step by step. So I think that me and Jade becoming that decision maker at the top and being like, oh my God, we have to decide what to do with this. It's quite empowering. It's quite, maybe not stressful, but just a little bit of an odd feeling, but that's what makes us come from one step to another. So it's important to get that confidence to make those decisions. And we've never been in a situation where we made a decision and one of our collaborators said, okay, no, I'm out because I don't like this, which doesn't mean that it might not happen in the future. But this is our strategy for now and it's been working and we're making progress, and I think that's important. Okay, Jade.
Yeah, I'm just gonna continue with what you were just saying about being decision makers. So when it comes to my PhD, so when I started my PhD, for example, I kind of looked to my supervisors for the answers when I didn't know what to do. Like, I was so afraid of making decisions and have it be the wrong decision. And I think the process of a PhD takes you from being that very nervous person that doesn't want to take ownership of your PhD, and then at the end you're supposed to transition into this independent researcher who knows how to make decisions. And in a sense that is true. I did kind of go through that with my PhD, but with NIRO we kind of, purely because we started the project, we sort of ended up as de facto project leaders, but we didn't have the opportunity to ask questions of many other people before that. And I think that's one of the most difficult things of managing a big collaboration, especially at this kind of career level, is trying to have the confidence to make decisions. I think it helps that we kind of try and take a very friendly and welcoming approach to it all. So if someone wants to help, we will let them help. We don't kind of gatekeep it or say, you can't do that, you can't do this. We let people kind of have their own ideas and bring what they want to it, but we do still have to make some decisions, and I'm still finding that really difficult. When it comes to managing an international collaboration, that's tricky because a lot of people are in bed when we're working. So because we have collaborators both in Australia and New Zealand and also in the US, and then time zone wise we're in the middle, we're on BST at the moment, so it can be tricky. So we have a few early morning meetings and a few late at night meetings. I think one of the good things about NIRO as well is it was the only thing in my life that was unaffected mostly by COVID, because we already kind of had the workflow of doing this from home at weird times of day, and spending hours and hours on Zoom and Skype working on this. So like Marta said, we have working days regularly where we spend 8 hours on Zoom, so it's a full working day, and we just work together, sometimes in silence, just to get things done. Yeah, so that's sort of the collaboration side. I was also just going to say experience of this collaboration has been great for imposter syndrome. So my level of imposter syndrome is very high, and in a way this project gives me more imposter syndrome, but it also gives me more opportunities to battle imposter syndrome. So in a way it kind of evens itself out and is quite beneficial. I still have this horrible feeling that someone's going to say, what are you doing? Like, this is not necessary, please stop. It hasn't happened yet after a year and a half, so I'm remaining hopeful, but battling imposter syndrome day by day with this project.
Thank you.
I think I'm going to end there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jade and Marta. That was super informative. And I am going to stop the recording now, and we are going to move to the